U.S. President Donald Trump says he has struck his biggest trade deal yet.
To U.S. President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs, while countries like Canada say they're working to negotiate better trade deals with the U.S. president, Trump is doubling down on the use of tariffs as a way to boost the U.S. economy.
Carney refused to yield. There were no apologies, no attempts to walk back Canada's stance, and no effort to soothe the president's anger. Instead, Ottawa held its ground, projecting calm when the White House unleashed fury. Trump, frustrated and impatient, accused Canada of exploiting American farmers, reciting inflated numbers about tariffs and subsidies. He even implied that U.S. military protection gave him the right to dictate Canada's economic policies. Sovereignty, in his telling, was not a principle, but a privilege America could revoke. Beneath the noise, the facts told another story. For decades, Canada and the United States have cultivated one of the most balanced and deeply integrated trade relationships in the world. Tariffs were not weapons pulled at will, but terms shaped through agreements on both sides. By framing Canada as a threat, Trump wasn't trying to correct the system. He was inventing an adversary, turning a trusted ally into a convenient villain for his own political theater. The clash revealed two very different approaches to leadership. Trump relied on intimidation, public threats, and sweeping declarations. Carney countered with steadiness, guided by the principle that sovereignty could not be traded away. The president may have expected Canada to fold quickly, but he ran into a government prepared for a drawn-out battle. The timing only heightened the pressure. Economic numbers in the United States were beginning to weaken. Job growth came in below expectations and revisions erased hundreds of thousands of positions from earlier reports. Analysts pointed directly to uncertainty from Trump's tariffs as the reason businesses were slowing investment and hiring. Yet, instead of acknowledging the problem, Trump lashed out at the data itself, accusing government statisticians of rigging the numbers. It was a revealing moment when a leader attacks the scoreboard rather than the reality it reflects. It shows not confidence but insecurity. Ottawa understood this dynamic and responded with its own long-term strategy. Instead of scrambling to defuse every new threat, Canada began reinforcing its economic base. Investments poured into domestic industries such as steel, aluminum, and advanced manufacturing. The goal was not retaliation, but resilience by strengthening production at home and diversifying trade abroad. Canada reduced the leverage Washington thought it held. Foreign partners noting Canada's steadiness signaled their interest in deeper economic ties. The effect was striking. Each time Carney refused to concede, he reinforced the idea that Canada's prosperity did not depend on the mood of the White House. Economic resilience, he argued, was built through independence, not through submission. This deliberate approach reshaped the standoff. While Trump tried to keep Canada off balance with escalating rhetoric, Ottawa steadied itself through preparation. What Trump demanded was not a balanced deal, but control. He treated negotiations as an extension of his business playbook, seeking advantage through pressure rather than cooperation. Carney's refusal to budge left that tactic powerless. The confrontation evolved into a contest of endurance. Trump relied on shock and escalation, counting on fatigue to break Canada's resolve. Carney relied on consistency, knowing that steady strength could outlast chaotic fury. Canadian officials described sovereignty as a muscle that weakens if unused. To yield would have set a precedent, so standing firm became more than a defense of one policy. It was a defense of national independence itself. Even in the realm of trade mechanics, Trump's leverage was thinner than it appeared. Under the updated North American Agreement, Canada had secured protections covering nearly 90% of its exports to the U.S. These safeguards weren't accidental. They were built into the deal through detailed negotiations on rules of origin and tariff exemptions. European and Japanese exporters remained more exposed, but Canada had already insulated much of its economy. That architecture transformed Trump's threats into something closer to theater than reality. The tariffs he waved like weapons were blunted by the very agreement he had championed. Advisors inside his own administration acknowledged those limits even as the president continued to portray Canada as vulnerable. In practice, the risk to Canada's exports was far smaller than his rhetoric suggested. Carney had in effect neutralized the threat before it was made. By focusing on groundwork rather than spectacle, Canada ensured that no midnight post could seriously destabilize its economy. The difference between the two leaders grew sharper by the day. One relied on bluster and performance, the other on quiet preparation and patience. As weeks passed, Trump's pressure campaign began to resemble theater more than strategy. Ottawa no longer scrambled to respond. The threats became routine. Background noise against a larger effort to build new alliances and expand economic capacity at home. What was meant to destabilize instead reinforced Canada's stability. Each new wave of rhetoric confirmed that Ottawa's choice to hold firm had been the right one. In the end, the lesson was not the one Trump intended to deliver. His midnight blast, his exaggerated claims, and his warnings of unfair treatment failed to secure submission. Canada's economy kept growing. Its trade defenses held, and its leadership emerged with credibility strengthened. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate a neighbor ended as a demonstration of how preparation and resilience can outlast noise and fury. Trump had threatened fire, but Canada had already built fireproof walls. The trade dispute was only one piece of a larger puzzle. At the same time, Trump was directing his attention toward the Federal Reserve. His criticism of Jerome Powell, the chair he himself had appointed, had grown into open hostility. He demanded lower interest rates and floated the idea that Powell should step aside. Then came another twist. Federal Reserve Governor Adriana Kohler announced her resignation, leaving a vacancy Trump could fill. That opening gave him the chance to install an ally and shape the institution's future direction, potentially even choosing Powell's eventual successor. This maneuvering carried consequences that stretch far beyond tariffs. The Federal Reserve was designed to remain independent of partisan politics. Yet, Trump had already shown a willingness to remove labor commissioners, replace regulatory boards, and attack government agencies that published data he disliked. Now, his reach extended toward the very body that sets monetary policy for the world's largest economy. The stakes were enormous. If the Fed became another political instrument, global markets could lose the stability they depend on. For Ottawa, this was more than a warning. It was evidence that Canada's push to diversify trade and strengthen its own economic foundations was not optional, but essential. Carney's long-term vision was to shield the country from shocks created south of the border. Where Trump sought control over institutions to serve his image, Carney sought resilience that would outlast political cycles. That contrast defined the moment. Furthermore, and the fragility of Trump's economic claims became visible when the latest employment as America's closest the illusion of strength was singled out. Projected. What drew Trump's eye was the May and June job numbers era raised more than a quarter of a million positions. Ottawa had chosen to act on its own terms. May once portrayed as a quiet act of defiance added a mega 19,000 challenge. June barely refused 14,000. There were no economy of America's no attempts to walk back Canada's stance. These figures were not only disappointing, and no effort to soothe the president's anger. Markets Instead, reflected the Ottawa shock, held its ground, tumbling through the day as investors confronted a reality that no presidential tweet could frustrated disguise. And impatient, even members of Trump's own economic exploiting American farmers that the policies they had celebrated numbers about tariffs and subsidies, suppressing hiring, he even implied that U.S. military protection gave him the right to dictate Canada's as a strategy to restore manufacturing dominance in his telling begun to accelerate the decline of the very workers it privilege America could revoke. The collapse was not confined to economics. The facts told another story. It carried immense political weight. Canada Trump had built his image on the promise of cultivated one of the most balanced that tariffs and trade wars would pressure other nations while leaving America untouched. Tariffs were not weapons pulled at will. The revisions demolished that narrative by exposing the costs at home. By framing Canada the central flaw of his approach, Trump wasn't trying to correct the head of the Bureau of Labor. He was inventing an adversary, blaming data collectors turning a trusted ally could not erase the fact that workers were losing jobs in the thousands. The clash revealed two very different rather than address the cause. It does not relied on intimidation, public betrays fear, and sweeping north of the border. Canada followed a different path. Guided by the Carney's government sovereignty could not be traded numbers turned against them. The president may have expected Canada to rewrite reality to fit political but he ran into a government prepared for a drawn-out was methodical. The timing only heightened the pressure. Came economic numbers in the United States were beginning to weaken. In doing so, came in below expectations away and revisions erased hundreds of thousands of American labor market showed strain. Canada's insulated directly to uncertainty protected by strategic agreements and businesses were slowing investment and hiring. Ottawa positioned itself instead of acknowledging the Trump's pressure. Trump lashed out as a beneficiary of his missteps, accusing government statisticians became undeniable in the arena of tariffs. It was a revealing moment when a leader and Japan had been compelled to accept deals with Washington that imposed it shows not confidence but insecurity on nearly all of their exports. Oslo understood this dynamic and responded with its own long-term strategy. Through exemptions embedded in the modernized KSMA agreement, Canada began reinforcing Canadian economic base. To the U.S. remained investments poured into domestic even under Trump's most aggressive threats, aluminum, and advanced manufacturing. While the goal was not retaliation, saw their economies weighed down by broader media taxation at home and carried an economic shield. One Canada deliberately into the leverage Washington thought it held. The protection was no accident. Noting Canada's steadiness, it was the outcome of their interest in calculated negotiation. A reflection of Carney's belief that resilience must be designed into agreements rather than improvised. He reinforced the idea that Canada's strength of those exemptions not depend on the blame why Trump's anger toward Canada economic resilience seemed less strategic and more personal. Was built through independence. It is difficult to intimidate a neighbor who already holds deliberate the stronger approach reshaped the standoff. Public threats lose impact while Trump when the law itself has already secured with escalating rhetoric. Trump, however, steadied itself has always been drawn to the performance of victory. What Trump demanded was not a balanced deal. He thrives on ceremonies, he treated negotiations and the visual drama of his business playbook paper before seeking advantage through pressure rather than cooperation, not by the theater surrounding refusal to budge but by the text within. Powerless. Many of the deals he announced evolved into a contest of endurance beyond press releases. Trump relied on shock and escalation between performance and implementation. Canada's resolve. Canada quietly advanced. Carney relied on consistency. Carney never sought steady strength could outlast his goals were rooted in stability. Canadian officials described sovereignty as a muscle that and the kind of trade framework that could withstand would have set a precedent. So standing firm became more than a defense of one policy in priorities. It was a defense of national independence itself, responding impulsively even in the realm of trade mechanics. Trump's leverage was further ahead. Appeared. Canadian leaders understood that North American policy had to reflect Canadian values and Canadian interests, nearly 90% not American demands to the U.S. That independence became the very trait that provoked Trump's fury. They were built into the deal through detailed negotiations on rules of origin and tariff exemptions. As European and Japanese exporters remained more exposed, became the defining factor. But Canada had already insulated chaos as a weapon. Assuming relentless transformed Trump's opponent into something closer to theater than reality. Relied on patience. The tariffs he waved like temporary storms by the very agreement he had championed. To Canadian officials, advisors inside his own administration acknowledged those limits. It was an understanding that sovereignty, to portray Canada like muscle, as vulnerable, weakens if it is not exercised. The risk to Canada's exports would not simply smaller than his rhetoric suggested. It would erode had an foundation neutralized the threat before it was made. The economic reality on groundwork rather than that contrast. Canada ensured that no midnight post the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in the wake of its own trade war. The difference between the two industries remained sharper by the day. Its agreement provided protection. Performance. Its diversification abroad created new opportunities. As weeks passed, what appeared as external volatility began to resemble became an opening for Canadian expansion. Ottawa no longer resilience was not a theory. The threat was visible in practice. Background noise against a larger effort as his old new alliances lost their and expand economic capacity at home. Public threats. What was meant to destabilize instead reinforced Canada's stability. Against Canada's preparations, wave of rhetoric confirmed that Ottawa's choice when nearly 9 out of 10 exports were already shielded. In the end, the lesson was not the one Trump intended to deliver. That reality made Trump's attacks exaggerated claims rather than tactical, and his warnings of unfair data that arrived in July turned into another. Canada's economy kept growing. Only 73,000 new jobs appeared far below, and its leadership emerged with revisions to May and June removed another begun as an attempt to intimidate a neighbor ended as a demonstration of how preparation for an economy accustomed to adding well over 100,000 jobs per month. Fire. Such numbers Canada had already built fireproof walls. For an administration built on the promise of one piece of a larger puzzle. They represented humiliation. Trump was directing his attention toward the Federal Reserve. Behind each figure stood criticism of Jerome Powell, skilled workers suddenly idle, appointed, and communities grown into open hostility. The causes demanded lower interest rates and floated the idea that Powell's supply chains that had taken decades to build another twist, introduced volatility. Federal Reserve Governor Adriana Cola announced her resignation. Businesses postponed hiring because tomorrow's rules were unknowable. Gave him the chance to install an ally by economists and industry future direction, but his fixation on controlling Powell's eventual successor. The price of maneuvering was paid by workers. Stretch far beyond Canada tariffs. Drew its lesson clearly. The Federal Reserve when a neighbor's foundation to remain independent of partisan politics. Is to secure one's own. Yet, Trump had already shown a willingness to remove labor commissions for temporary regulatory boards. He declined every government agencies binding Canada to America's instability. Now, his reach extended toward the very body that sets monetary policy for the world's largest economy. By a sober reading of the stakes were enormous. Carney saw the storm building and another political instrument. Global markets could lose the stability they depend on, and kept Canada from being pulled under by a deal. This was more than a warning. Trump was evidence that Canada's push to diversify trade and strengthen its own economic foundations was not a calculated move that saved Canada. Carney's long-term vision with America facing the fallout shocks created how long south can Canada hold the line? Where Trump sought control over institutions, so you'll hear for the next video. Carney sought resilience that would outlast political cycles, and Mexico City contrast defined the moment. Yet Canada, long seen as America's closest partner, was singled out. Exhaust his opponent into submission. Carney relied on patience, holding steady until temporary storms lost their force. To Canadian officials, this was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was an understanding that sovereignty, like muscle, weakens if it is not exercised. Concession would not simply sacrifice one policy. It would erode the foundation of independence itself. The economic realities only reinforce that contrast. As the United States absorbed the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in the wake of its own trade war, Canada's industries remained stable. Its agreements provided protection. Its diverse